Welcome to Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler. Coming up, we'll review the week's top stories, including the Illinois gun ban trial, the Illinois Supreme Court taking up Jesse Smollett's conviction, and the rising costs of insurance premiums. Then the Center Square's Dan McCaleb and Greg Bishop will further discuss those stories and more. That's ahead with Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler.
Do you know what elected officials in Illinois are doing with your tax dollars? Do you want to make sure that your voice is heard? If so, then you need Blue Room Stream, a live and archived video streaming service that provides access to government meetings and events. With Blue Room Stream, you can watch how your elected officials make decisions, hold them accountable for their actions, and be a more informed citizen. Blue Room Stream is the perfect way to get involved in the democratic process and to make a difference in your community. Subscribe today at blueroomstream.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Kevin Bessler. Here are some of the top stories from the past week. A former member of the military and former police chief told a federal court the semi-automatic firearms Illinois banned are suitable for self-defense. Greg Bishop reports.
Day 3 of the bench trial for Illinois' gun ban featured plaintiff's witness Randy Watt. He served overseas in Afghanistan and Iraq, where he described the importance of having full auto rifles in battles with the enemy and said there weren't any semi-automatic only rifles in war. Back home as a law enforcement officer in Utah, Watt also described his history in training other officers and providing private self-defense training after retirement. Asked about the list of guns Illinois now bans, Watt said that they're all suitable for self-defense and different from military arms. Dane Harrell, a lead plaintiff from one of the consolidated cases, said Watt's testimony was powerful.
And he seemed to draw a clear distinction between the two. The semi-automatic firearms, which are available to American citizens, non-military, obviously have a place in our society for lawful purposes such as self-defense.
In East St. Louis, I'm Greg Bishop.
Former Empire actor Jesse Smollett's attorneys took his case before the Illinois Supreme Court Tuesday. Smollett was convicted of falsely reporting a hate crime against him in 2019. His attorneys argued he should never have faced the charges he was convicted of because the Cook County State's Attorney's Office made him a deal, leading to this exchange between one justice and attorney Nenny Yush.
Seems like we've got a lot of factual questions.
Yes, Justice.
What is the ultimate relief you're asking for?
Justice, I'm asking for reversal.
Sean Weber, Special Assistant Attorney General, told the court that there is no record of a non-prosecution deal between Smollett and prosecutors.
We had a baker's dozens of lawyers through this process. He was well counseled. He got the relief that is on the record that his lawyer stood up and said, quote, I absolutely agree with.
Smollett was found guilty of 5 counts of disorderly conduct of setting up the bogus attack. The Supreme Court has not given a timetable on a possible decision. The financial pinch of inflation is punishing Illinois homeowners and insurers. Jim Talamonte has that story.
According to data from Bankrate.com, the average Illinois homeowner's monthly premium has gone up 42% since January of 2023. Consumer Watchdog Executive Director Carmen Balber says a confluence of events have caused cost increases for insurance companies, starting with inflation.
But also that led to costs in labor increasing, construction costs increasing, materials costs increasing.
Balber said insurance companies reacted to losses in the stock market.
When the insurance industry loses money on Wall Street, they restrict sales or they raise prices because the money that they used to make on investments, they now want to make from premiums.
Balber also said there have been more weather-related losses. I'm Jim Talamonte.
Those are the top stories of the week from Illinois. Find more online at thecentersquare.com. Coming up for Illinois in Focus, the Center Square's Dan McCaleb and Greg Bishop will further discuss the news. This is Illinois in Focus, a production of America's Talking Network. I'm Kevin Bessler.
Teacher Lauren Johnson returned all the graded essays but one. He believed that one student was capable of more.
I don't believe taking the middle of the road is your philosophy. This time, write something you really believe.
The student wrote a new one about excellence. Instead of just grading an essay, Mr. Johnson changed a life. I am that student. I became a writer, and I wrote this to thank him.
Thank a teacher and pass it on from passiton.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Chief Content Officer at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. We are recording this on Thursday, September 19th, a long-awaited legal challenge to Illinois' 2023 law banning more than 170 semi-automatic handguns and rifles and magazines over certain capacities went to trial this week in East St. Louis. Illinois Associate Editor Greg Bishop was in the courtroom all week and joins me today to discuss the case. Welcome, Greg. Evidence and arguments in the civil case concluded today. Tell us about it.
Yeah, and it was rather fascinating. Well, of course, there's a lot to say about the testimony inside the courtroom. I think that Judge Stephen McGlynn really made the headline when, in closing out after final conclusive statements from plaintiffs and the state as defendants, really kind of takes the headline here. Judge McGlynn, he said that when they started this case last year, after the state banned these firearms and people filed in federal court, he questioned why the case was in East St. Louis. And ultimately, after reflecting on that, he asked that people visit the, quote, sacred sites in East St. Louis. And then he went into the history of this town back in 1917, where there was a race riot and scores of black-owned homes burned down because of rage-filled white individuals in East St. Louis. And he talked about all of the stories of people trying to escape from one burning home to another burning home, and even people jumping into the Mississippi River. Young people burned to death, people being hanged, people being dragged by noose, and just horrifying stories. And he says that, big question he asked was, what if those black victims had firearms that they were discussing all week long? So maybe not an indication of how he's going to rule in this case, but it was a rather fascinating way to wrap this case up. And Judge McGlynn making those comments in the final moments of court, and even showing a picture from 1917 where it showed the original federal court building in East St. Louis surrounded by burned out buildings, and saying that to him it looked like it was Vietnam, but that's the history of East St. Louis. He also said it wasn't just East St. Louis that they had race riots. He pointed to Tulsa, Oklahoma from 1921, where there was a similar race riot and black victims in that city. But then he said all the way, even recent history, he points to Aurora, Colorado, Dan, where they have video of an international gang going into an apartment building with high-powered rifles kicking in doors. So clearly he seems to be elevating the conversation to be about self-defense, and again asking the question, what if these victims of these heinous acts had these banned firearms? But to the substance of the case, what's interesting here is, Dan, go ahead.
That was an interesting opening. You just got out of the courtroom just moments ago, so you and I hadn't had a chance to talk about what happened today before our conversation right here and now. So that is a surprising twist to the development to the story today. Did you talk to either of the attorneys on either side? Did they comment on his closing statement?
Yeah, the state, they said they don't comment on pending litigation. Approached them several times throughout the week, and even got a statement from Attorney General Kwame Raoul's office saying they don't comment on pending litigation. But I was able to talk with David Siegel. He's a plaintiff's attorney for the Harrell plaintiffs and the Illinois State Rifle Association. And he said McGlynn's comments really resonated with why he got involved in these Second Amendment cases. He says that self-defense is crucial, and even pointing to a case out of Chicago where years ago there was a challenge to that city's gun control laws, and saying that if he could do anything to help individuals who may be victims of, say, an ex-lover who they have an order of protection in one hand and they're on 911 with the other hand, if he could do anything to save their another life by allowing them to protect themselves by having appropriate firearms, then it was worth getting into this fight. So he said McGlynn's comments really resonated. However, he was quick to say he doesn't want to assume any one way or the other that McGlynn will go with this. As McGlynn finished up the comments, He said they've got 30 days to file briefs back and forth before he makes an order. But, Dan, if you recall last year, McGlynn, the judge in this case, he did issue a preliminary injunction it lasted 6 days before the appeals court took the case up and reversed that injunction. So that might give you a little indication on how McGlynn is going to rule in this case. And the case is on final judgment, meaning this is it. This is on the merits. And after this, it's no longer in the district court. And it'll go back up to the appeals court. And what they discussed and getting to the merits of the conversation and the testimony and the evidence they presented throughout the 4-day trial here in East St. Louis, it really focused on the difference between civilian firearms and military firearms. And this was all in an effort to answer the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in their order of the preliminary injunction. They sided with the state, saying that the state had a likelihood of succeeding on the merits because the appeals court said that AR-15s are too adjacent, too similar to firearms carried by the military. Now, clear indication and a separation here, semi-automatic firearms, it's one trigger pull per round fired. Military firearms have a switch selector that goes from safe to semi-auto to sometimes burst, which shoots 3 rounds per trigger pull, or sometimes full auto, which you pull the trigger, it'll empty the entire magazine if you keep that trigger pulled. So that was something they discussed in great detail, building that record on final judgment in the East St. Louis case about the difference of military firearms and civilian firearms. The plaintiffs brought experts out who had worked in the firearms industry, developing firearms, talking about the clear difference they see in the materials used for civilian firearms versus military firearms. One plaintiff who worked for Remington laid out the detail as an engineer of the metallurgy that's done for military firearms to be able to take the pressure and the heat of being able to fire burst or full auto, and how those same types of metallurgy aren't necessarily put into civilian firearms, and saying that if you convert a civilian firearm to full or burst auto, it's likely going to destroy that firearm and melt the barrel and cause damage to the individual. But you also had the defense with the state calling witnesses former members of the military fighting overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, who testified they recommend only semi-automatic firearms, or rather firing in semi-auto mode while in battle. They say that's more accurate than firing full auto, which sprays bullets all over the place. So they tried backing that up and saying that they would recommend using semi-auto in battle. But even the defense witnesses, both of them, the two that testified this week in court, they both said that they would not, one of them said today, Thursday, the final day, that they wouldn't prefer a ban. They would rather have training. They would rather have accountability over a ban. So the plaintiffs saw that as a win in their column. The other defense witness said that he would not recommend that the military get rid of full auto, saying that full auto in the military is a last line of defense. So clearly, the plaintiffs walking away pretty confident that they could get a permanent injunction issued by Judge Stephen McGlynn here in the Southern District. Now, what happens after that in a month or so when McGlynn issues his ruling, if it is an injunction, likely it's going to go to the appeals court, where it's a question of just how quick they would act on any particular type of injunction if McGlynn issues one. But regardless, whichever way this case goes, it's likely going to the appeals court.
Possibly after that, the U.S. Supreme Court?
Yeah, and what's interesting here is the U.S. Supreme Court had already taken this case on preliminary grounds and denied hearing it. If you recall, earlier this year, Justice Clarence Thomas, he said that the case isn't ready yet. It was only on preliminary grounds, and he wanted a full record on challenging firearms bans so that they could tackle that full record by the U.S. Supreme Court. At that time, Illinois didn't have a full record, and that's what was being developed here in East St. Louis with the 4-day bench trial and all the evidence and the testimony. But before Illinois' gun ban even gets that far, you could actually see the challenge to Maryland's gun ban being brought up, because that was already dealt with by the appeals court in the Maryland district, meaning they're filing with the U.S. Supreme Court. So we could see the Maryland case get to the U.S. Supreme Court and decided way before Illinois' gun and magazine ban even gets out of the appeals court.
Greg has been covering this story since, lawmakers debated and passed the law back in early 2023. A couple other stories I want to touch on, Greg, here. Former Empire actor Judge Smollett, his attorneys took his appeal of his conviction of staging and falsely reporting a hate crime against him in 2019. They were before the Illinois Supreme Court on appeal.
This is just a fascinating case where Smollett, if you recall, made a lot of headlines being in Chicago on a film shoot for a TV show. And in 2021, he was ultimately found guilty of disorderly conduct for making up a hate crime against him in 2019. And rewind back to 2019. This was, of course, before COVID, and you had the headlines and major news publications picked it up that a Hollywood actor in Chicago was the victim of a hate crime. Judge Smollett, he made the rounds on these various national news outlets, talking about how, as a black gay man, attackers attacked him wearing red "Make America Great Again" hats, and even shouting racist and homophobic slurs. And one quote that he said his attackers used was, "This is MAGA country," in Chicago. That itself was a red flag to some people who questioned what exactly was going on here. And police, they investigated. They investigated a hate crime and spent numerous police man hours trying to get to the bottom of this and reviewing surveillance video and trying to find the assailants. But then it was quickly found out that the assailants were actually some extras on the film set with Smollett. And they said that Smollett paid them to beat him up and to conduct this supposed crime. So this was investigated by police. Prosecutors ended up prosecuting him. But what's interesting is Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox at that time had actually worked to put together some kind of non-prosecution agreement with Smollett that would say that he would just have to forfeit his $10,000 bond and do some community service in exchange for having the case dismissed and the original charges dismissed. But that was never officially entered. There was some controversy around the Fox's office having some relationship with people familiar with Smollett, and ultimately they had to bring in a special prosecutor who actually brought the charges that ended up sticking against Smollett in 2021, where he was found guilty of 5 counts of disorderly conduct, and he was sentenced to 150 days in jail, 30 months probation, and ordered to pay $130,000 in restitution to cover the man hours that were used to investigate these allegations that he made. So ultimately, he only served 6 days of that sentence before he was let go out of concern for his safety in jail. And now this has gone to the appeals court, which upheld the charges, and then up to the Illinois Supreme Court, which heard the case this week. And ultimately, the defense in the case tried to bring up this non-prosecution agreement that Kim Fox's office was preparing to enter. But the states ultimately said that was never officially entered, and Smollett is guilty of these crimes and should face the penalty for that. The court, of course, as the Supreme Court typically does, took the case under advisement. We could see a ruling in this case in the months ahead.
Turning to another criminal case in Illinois, this one involving longtime former Speaker, House Speaker Michael Madigan. He and his attorneys have been filing motion after motion in recent months trying to exclude evidence from his upcoming October trial on 23 counts of corruption-related charges. A judge ruled recently that a professor will be able to testify about Chicago's political machine at the trial. Tell us more.
Yeah, so Dick Simpson, University of Illinois Chicago professor, he's well-versed in Chicago machine politics. He knows all the ins and outs about the history of it and how the various leaders of Chicago's wards use the political machine to curry favor and to get jobs. So he's expected to be an expert witness. And Madigan's attorneys tried to block Simpson from actually being provided as an expert witness in this, saying it would be unreliable, irrelevant, and highly prejudicial. But the judge in this case disagreed, and he is actually going to allow Simpson to testify in that case that's expected to start in October. That case, we'll be watching that very closely as Madigan faces corruption allegations, 22 different counts of trying to curry benefits for himself and his associates in exchange for jobs with ComEd, the state's one of the state's largest utilities. And all of that, of course, is meant to try to get favorable legislation for ComEd. Remember that the ComEd 4 trial found guilty 4 individuals, several with ComEd and an associate of Madigan. They were found guilty already in that case. In Madigan's case coming up next month, it's going to be interesting to see exactly how Simpson's testimony will be used, because the judge said while Simpson will be allowed to testify, there are some boundaries that he set. So for instance, Simpson is not going to necessarily be able to share some of his just general opinions on various political happenings, but it appears that he is going to be there to provide somewhat of a historical analysis of sorts of Chicago's political machine.
Interesting. And for all things Madigan corruption trial related, listeners can keep up with the news at thecentersquare.com. Greg, have about 2 minutes left to get to one more story, actually 2 stories combined. As if inflation weren't enough, as if Illinois' high taxes weren't enough, it's looking like both car insurance and separately home insurance rates are going to be going up in Illinois. Tell us about
it. As you mentioned, Illinois residents already pay a really high tax burden. Sales taxes, corporate taxes. We have the second highest property taxes. Our sales tax, cumulative, all taxes, about 10.25%. But you add on all the other costs that are associated with, living in a state like Illinois, and insurance costs are up. Those who drive are expected to see a boost in their insurance premiums by 10% before the end of the year. Inflation impacting that. And you've got as well crime in urban areas impacting that. And even the possibility, some are worried of the state changing the law to say that insurance companies cannot base somebody's insurance rate on zip code. And that could mean that everybody would have to pay a higher rate to make up for that. But it's also home insurance, Dan. You've got bankrate.com saying that the average Illinois homeowner's monthly premium has gone up 42% since January of last year. So high taxes, high insurance rates in the land of Lincoln.
Always the bearer of good news.
That's what you paid me for, Dan.
Well, listen, thanks for all of your insight into this week's top story. Glad you, after the trial in East St. Louis, glad you can get back to maybe a little bit of normalcy. As always, listeners can keep up with all of the stories we talked about and more at thecentersquare.com.